And welcome back to the Inside the Rink podcast. In episode 27, we will cover Canada wins the Four Nations face-off. There was also big numbers for the Four Nations ratings. Kevin Lankinen was extended in Vancouver. Kirill Kaprizov's injury is longer than originally expected. The NHL has met with a group about a potential New Orleans expansion franchise, and there's a lot of trade deadline chatter to go around. But without further ado, I want to welcome my co-host, Chris Lavalley. Chris, how are you doing?
I am fantastic, and my goodness, is there a lot to talk about tonight?
Oh, I know. I I don't know about you. It's like the last week I was getting all these notes ready, and you probably got all the updates, and I'm like, oh my goodness, is this going to be like a really long show, or are we gonna have to separate this into two? But now we have this one pretty flush show, and I'm pretty confident. And yeah, like without further ado, I want to hear a word from our sponsor, DraftKings Sportsbook.
DraftKings Sportsbook is Boston's hometown sportsbook. It's live right here in Massachusetts. Bet local on all your favorite sports from the comfort of your own home with DraftKings. To celebrate, all new customers will receive up to $250 in bonus bets when you sign up for DraftKings Sportsbook using code ITR. You can now bet local on moneyline spreads, props, and more with one of America's top-rated sportsbooks. That's DraftKings Sportsbook. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app. Sign up with the code ITR to get up to $250 in bonus bets to use. Now that mobile sports betting is live in Massachusetts, that's code ITR, and it's only at DraftKings Sportsbook.
If your loved one is experiencing problems with gambling, call 800-327-5050 or visit helplinema.org to speak with a trained specialist free and confidentially 24/7. Must be 21 plus. Physically present in Mass. Eligibility restrictions apply. Subject to regulatory licensing requirements. Eligibility and deposit restrictions apply. Opt-in required. Bonus issued as free bets. Terms at DraftKings.com/MA.
Well, I think the Four Nations is one of those tournaments that we all want to see back. I know for myself, it's one that I want to see back. And with the way that the NHL hopes to rotate World Cup of Hockey, Olympics, for like Four Nations or whatever they do, I'm looking forward to it. And the ratings certainly show that. And first on the list is the ratings for the Four Nations, and they were well over double the expected numbers. 16.1 million viewers, 9.3 million in the United States, and 6.3 million in Canada. It's the second most watched hockey game in the past decade, behind Game 7 of the 2024 Stanley Cup Final, which drew 16.3 million viewers. Also topped every U.S. Cable telecast except for the NHL, college football, and election coverage. That's per the NHL. So it's got quite the backing for it. And I know from everything that's happened with the political tensions that took place, without getting into those, it added a whole different layer. And I guess people were a little bit more eager to watch these tournaments. And I don't know, from your perspective, seeing the Detroit players in the tournament, like,
I watched every single game. It was must-watch TV every time, whether you're a fan of U.S., Canada, Sweden, Finland. They were all must-watch TV. And I was at work on my phone. I had the game up while I'm doing whatever I'm doing. And my issue, though, is with the start time of that championship game. And I say this for every single sport. Us as adults, we're 8 o'clock is fine. But what about the kids? And I say this: baseball, football, all of them. Like championship games, big games that people want to see. Start them at 7:30.
or even earlier
I
than
fell
that.
asleep right at the end of the third period. I had work the next day, so I was tired from the day. So that 30 minutes, I'm not missing overtime if it starts at 7:30. That's my
Yeah,
personal opinion. I don't know how other people feel, but
Chris, I'll be honest with you. I watched the end of it. I got to overtime, and once they scored and they celebrated, I was like, all right, going to bed, because I was fighting to stay awake at the end of the third period, and I couldn't. If it went to another overtime, I was going to say, you know what? I'll watch this in the morning and I'll see what happens and all that. I watched all the medal ceremony and the trophy presentation in the morning, and I think that's the case for a lot of people. But when you say the start time, I think honestly, maybe even earlier, like the Super Bowl's early.
Mhm.
You have big games like that being a 5 o'clock game in Central Standard Time. Why not start a game like that at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock? It's, I think it was a Thursday that it took place.
It was Wednesday, but you see, then
Wednesday.
you're dealing with people commuting home. So like now you're running into the people. I think 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time is perfect, or 7:30, because I mean realistically they said 8, and what puck drop was probably closer, if not 8:30.
Yeah,
So like
closer
if
to
you say
8:30.
7:30 and you do puck drop and all of that, and it's 8 o'clock, now you're saving yourself that 30 minutes where, like you said, you shut it off right after the end and went to bed. I struggled to stay awake and I fell asleep right at the end of the third period, and I just couldn't make it anymore. Now I
Well, my
watched the whole
brothers and
thing the
I,
next day, but
like my brothers and I, we went to Boston Pizza to watch the game, and we spent 30 minutes and we got our food by the time the puck was dropped. That, like, we showed up a little after 7 and the puck hadn't dropped by the time we got our food. So I was tired by end of the second even. So I understand what you're saying, even with the commuting thing. And where I'm from, like Manitoba, traffic, commuting, rush hour could be about 45 minutes to an hour, depending where you're going, where you're turning, what streets you need to go down. But once you get out of that downtown, which not as bad as people make it sound to be in Winnipeg, it doesn't take that long. So honestly, honestly, maybe even 6:30 could be the sweet spot, because then people would plan, if they're just going by themselves or they're meeting people there, is I'll just have whatever I need to take to work with me and then go from work to the game. Or if the game's a 5 o'clock game on a Wednesday or a Thursday, don't you think people would kind of plan their week around that, their work week? Maybe try to get off work earlier. Like, I know a lot of people that I had talked to is they were supposed to work 11 to 7 or 5 to 12, and they made sure they worked morning like 7 to 3, and they were off like 4 hours before the game started. And like
so
it
here,
was,
well,
there's a lot
so
of conversation to be had.
we got a
Go ahead.
comment on Twitter when I posted a graphic about one of the games, and somebody had said they listened to the podcast and they agree on the time. Now, we went into that Monday. We recorded Monday night, and it was USA Finland, no, USA Sweden, and we already knew that Canada was in the championship game. Now, say for whatever reason, Finland or Sweden get into that championship game. Now, just I pulled it up on my phone because I'm looking at it. Say, for instance, Sweden somehow got in, and they're in that championship game against the U.S. And puck drop for my time was 8:30. It's 8:30 right now as we're recording. As of right now in Sweden, it's 2:30 in the morning. So, like, what's the numbers look like? Obviously, it's USA Canada, so the numbers were what they were. But if it's Sweden, I mean, I'm still watching. I think that's a great game, but 2:30 a.m. Who in Sweden staying up until 2:30 to watch puck drop, and you still got 3 hours, and then you got to go to work.
That's if they go into work after
Well,
staying up that late to watch the game. So,
right.
but Canada winning with the way the game went, I had that good feeling looking at the whole game from the outside, looking at the odds and seeing everything that had happened with the lineups. I was like, this has to be an overtime game. There's no way it won't be. And of course, everybody in Canada, at least, is saying Connor McDavid gets his moment and it's like a symbolic passing of the torch moment from Crosby to McDavid, because Crosby scored the big golden goal against the States in 2010 at the Vancouver Olympic Games, and now McDavid gets one in 2025, 15 years later. I don't know if you can realistically compare the two, but given the way that the tournament played out, the first game being 3 fights in 9 seconds, which nobody saw coming, by the way. The second game, if there was a few fights in the game, I wouldn't have been surprised myself. And just the landscape heading into the game with the extra political tension, the video, or not the video, the report that came out that the 47th U.S. president, Donald Trump, calls the states in the dressing room or something along those lines. I know he at least called them because that had came out from Sarah Volley. And so, the Canadians are amped up, the Americans are amped up. And the other thing I want to point out is the booing of both anthems at the game, which is mind-blowing to me because like I said, I was in Boston Pizza, which is weird that iconic Canadian food joint named after an iconic American hockey city. That's just redundant in itself. When you have these tensions and these layers that feed in, it's just this one. I don't want to call it a ball, but it's like like those electric balls that you see the electricity.
Yep.
It's kind of like you're watching that grow and get brighter and brighter as things have to come to a breaking point. And where I was, like Boston Pizza, it was loud in the lounge. They had the game on like full blast, I swear. And the Americans boo the Canadian anthem first, and I'm like, holy crap. I thought they did it last time and they didn't. Well, the second time around, when the Canadians booed the U.S. anthem in the United States, never mind, you have it was equally loud, and so it shows you the commitment of both countries to go and support the game. I think it was just the cherry on top because the first game was in Montreal and the second game was in Boston, which is another undertone because the Bruins and the Habs have a huge rivalry of their own, and it's fitting considering the pride and the passion that was on display from both the fans and the players on the ice. And heading into the tournament, I was one of the people who was skeptical that is this just going to be an exhibition tournament that the players don't care about, or is this going to be something that the players actually they're going to try and kill each other to win this damn trophy? And it was the latter. Like, for viewing purposes, thankfully, but with the injuries and the flu bug that came out during the tournament and after, there's a lot to consider because McAvoy's hurt, Theodore's hurt, Kachuk's Brady Kachuk's day-to-day, Matthew Kachuk's hurt. He could be out for an extended time. And the list is like, it seems like it's growing.
Mm-hmm.
Chris, I don't know about you, but do you think there would be more of a buffer, or should the NHL create more of a buffer time after the tournament to let teams and players get a time to readjust and reset to the NHL season?
I think they kind of have to. I mean, obviously, like we said, this is the inaugural tournament. So they're going to see how it went. Obviously, now they see what happened. They're going to fix the hiccups they had, and we'll see something going forward. I don't know how they handle a break. Like, you can't, realistically, I don't know if you can do another week. Like, that would be the thing that makes the most sense, is do another week, let everybody heal and have a little vacation as well. But at the same time, for the sake of the season, I don't know if you can.
No.
So,
and I don't think that, because at the end of the day, hockey is hockey, and these players were playing hockey. So they were getting reps in while the other players who were on vacation, they're resting up. So you have well-rested players who are sitting, doing something, or maybe they're on the sidelines nursing an injury. You have guys who are coming back from a tournament, maybe bitter that they didn't perform as well as they would have liked to, or maybe they're trying to survive the rest of the NHL season. There's a lot to consider, but like I said, at the end of the day, hockey is hockey, and it doesn't take these guys long to readjust to the NHL schedule and get back to practices and games. They got their reps in throughout the tournament, and maybe they're saying, you know what, I'm mad that I didn't get I wasn't on the first line for Team Sweden when I feel like I should have been, and X, Y, and Z. Like I said, it's a lot to consider, and it's reps that come into play for these guys. I don't look at it as one of those tournaments where guys are going to say, "Oh, I wasted my time off and I shouldn't have went to it," because they didn't want to go. Well, they had their chance and they could have given the teams notice, but all these guys wanted to represent their country, obviously.
I don't think any of them feel that way. And the more interesting thing is we got to remember where next year the break is the Olympics. So now you're talking more players from the NHL playing in a tournament, the Olympics. But so now you got to bring Russia, so you had like a player like Ovechkin and other players like that are Draisaitl for Germany.
That's if the International Committee of Hockey, if they allow Russia back in, because I know for the World Junior sake and the World Championship that Russia and Belarus are not allowed in. Is they're temporarily banned because of the war in Ukraine, which is a whole political thing in itself. But with the way that things are going throughout the world politically, we don't know what's going to happen, and we don't know how landscapes can change by that time. Maybe the International Ice Hockey Committee decides that they want to let Russia back in because there are Russian players who don't have anything to do with what's going on in that country, but are still wanting to display these really great hockey players. I want to get off the topic of politics because this is a hockey podcast, first and foremost. The International Ice Hockey Committee, they'll make their decision, and I think displaying these players will be, regardless, it'll be a good idea letting them back in. And having countries or all countries displayed, great. When you got to look at it from the perspective of the NHL hosted, it was their tournament. The Four Nations, it was their tournaments. The Olympics, it belongs to the IIHF. So I can see why the NHL would be hesitant to send their players or have their players go to that, and I can see why they're hesitant for so long. Chris, I don't know about you. If I was a team and say my top guy got hurt, would you want your guy to go back or future players to go back? There's a lot of layers to it.
At the end of the day, though, that might, if a team says that to their top player, that may also handicap them on future free agents going there as well.
Yeah. And speaking of guys who are going to be free agents, Kevin Lankinen signs for 5 years, $4.5 million a season. And my first question is it too much or is it too little? And I feel like the extension's too soon.
I think it's a panic move. I think they saw Thatcher Demko go down with his second injury this season, and they said, we got to lock this guy up and keep him around because we need a goalie that we can trust to keep us in the playoff spot and get us to the playoffs. I mean, who knows? Demko's not in this road trip, so who knows how long he's out for, but I think that was part of it, was just panic.
Yeah, well, that's one of my points I want to bring up, but the first point I want to bring up is, regardless of sample size or career thing, the rising salary cap certainly has a factor in this extension. Because if that salary cap's only going up at 5% or whatever it is, I don't see Lankinen getting $4.5 million realistically. But with that drastic uptick, Lankinen got that contract because he's trusted to be Vancouver's number one guy, and he's also going to be there to play X amount of games for that dollar. But does this extension, does it signal a long-term worry about Demko staying healthy? And I would say yes, because maybe it's a thing where it's Demko, I don't want to say falling out of favor, but maybe they're just saying, you know what, we need two guys that we can rely on to be the starting goaltender. And maybe it's a 1A, 1B situation like Boston had with Swayman and Ullmark. Maybe that's what they hope to have, where if one goes down, God forbid, then the other guy can step in, and then you have a third guy you can rely on. But why would Vancouver feel the need to lock up another goaltender to a contract with term while things could or could not sort themselves out? There's like layers is a big thing with everything, and I feel like the Lankinen extension in it of itself, the term is signaling that, like you said, it's a panic move, but there's something more that we don't know.
They do have. You're gonna have to help me with the pronunciations. It's Silovs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so he's been okay for them this year. So even with Demko being out, he's been a decent backup. But like I said, a lot of it signifies, I think they look at it as they're in a playoff spot right now, and I think the majority of that is because of Lankinen. And so they rewarded him because of that. And with the Demko injury, because I believe, if I remember correctly, he didn't start the season. So they, large part they're in the spot they're in right now is because of Lankinen. And so they rewarded him with the extension because they want to have somebody like him locked up that they can trust with Demko's injury history. I mean, this is obviously his second one this season alone.
And his first one, I know it was something that was very worrisome.
I believe it was the knee. Was it the knee?
Yeah, the knee. Sorry. But talking about players who are injured currently, and Kirill Kaprizov, his injury, he was only supposed to be out 4 weeks after he had his surgery, and now he's out longer with his lower body injury after his surgery in January, and he was originally expected to be out 4 weeks, but now the general manager of the Minnesota Wild, Bill Guerin, has said that it's a matter of how he progresses. It's very interesting wording. And when you see star players have that, like, it's wording, everything is wording. And Kaprizov's injury, it's going to be something that could it affect the Wild's plans at the deadline, or could they build around it? Because
it's definitely going to affect their plans at the deadline. There's no question in my mind about that one. They're going to start looking at big name players or somebody that they can add for scoring. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, he's been out, I forget, I think it was, early January, was it end of December? And he's still, at this point in time, being out as long as he has their leading scorer.
Yeah.
So they got to find a way, if he's going to be out long term, even potentially an LTIR candidate, they're going to have to add somebody to fix that scoring. I mean, they obviously look good on Saturday with their comeback win, but they got to fix something there to get that scoring replaced.
And I wonder if Chris, we'll get into Rantanen later, but I wonder if they take a big swing at the deadline, or if they find a guy who can play the second or third line, but adds that scoring punch that they need. Because at the end of the day, you don't know if Kaprizov's back in a month or if he's back come the Western Conference Finals.
Right.
And that's sorry.
There's names we're going to get to that I think could cover everything that they could look for, but that's obviously a conversation we'll have in a little bit.
Yeah, and well, speaking of teams and adding more, the NHL has met with a group interested in a New Orleans franchise. And, well, Kevin Weeks reported it, and it's not a market that I thought the NHL would end up in or even explore. Just considering off of how much they're looking at and who's looking at them. It's not I wouldn't say it's a traditional hockey market because like they got the New Orleans Pelicans with in the NBA, but every market's different and they'll do their due diligence. And the other thing I want to note is Gary Bettman. It's noted that he's as non-committal as possible about when the NHL will expand past 32 teams. So the league preference is to return to the Phoenix market after the Coyotes' sale to Utah, which is also another interesting thing because it's kind of known the Coyotes, they went down swinging with everything they had to stay in Arizona. So when they went to Utah, they kept all the trademark and records and all that as the Coyotes, and they started Utah as its own. I still have a hard time kind of wrapping my head around that, but with this all being said and done, New Orleans will join a long list of cities that are interested in an NHL club. We know Houston and Atlanta either currently or building an NHL arena or already have one. We know that they've been interested in heavily talk to the NHL about a team.
Yeah, I thought for sure it was going to be Atlanta. Like I was surprised when the report came out that it was New Orleans. But I look at like you said, obviously Phoenix moved to Utah, and they have just basketball there.
Yeah.
And I mean New Orleans has football, but I wonder if do they look at what the success Utah's had attendance wise from the Jazz now to hockey, and they see New Orleans with the Pelicans. Are they trying to explore that opportunity? Obviously, Atlanta has a basketball team, Houston has a basketball team, and so far those are the top three. Because I mean, we've heard Atlanta and Houston more recently, and now we hear New Orleans. So are they looking at the other sports and the success they have, and now they're exploring those cities more so?
And the only professional hockey team to carry the New Orleans moniker was the ECHL's New Orleans Brass. They briefly affiliated themselves with the San Jose Sharks, which I find interesting. But they spent 5 years in the ECHL from 1997-98 all the way to 2001-2022. Another thing to note is the most likely scenario is Atlanta or Houston gets expansion number 33, and then Phoenix gets number 34, or vice versa. And with that reporting saying with or vice versa, it makes you wonder why Bettman is as non-committal as possible. And it's a lot of things to like if I had a wall, I'd have all these like crime scene strings linking things together with this whole thing, but I don't, and it would be cool if I did. But you also have to look at other potential groups and markets like Cincinnati, Hamilton, Kansas City, Omaha, Quebec City, and Saskatoon. Like they've all expressed interest in NHL franchises at one point or another, or currently expressing interest in franchises. So if the NHL expands past 32, I don't know how much more they push up, but you also have to wonder is when money talks, and we all know Bettman, he'll raise the price, and if people are willing to pay, they might get a team.
I think a lot of people want the Nordiques back too.
Yeah, oh yeah. And it would, with having like, not saying there will be another bubble season of any sort, but if there were to be something of that sort or a similar kind of thing where they have to do that, if you have 8 Canadian teams, it makes for a whole different spectacle, because then you can schedule things a little easier, and on top of that, you have 8 teams instead of an odd number. You have an even number instead of the odd number, and I think if Quebec were to get this like the Nordiques back, it would probably be expansion number 35 or 36 or a relocation. It has like it wouldn't be one of the next two expansions. That's
Yeah.
what I'm thinking. But Chris, I don't know about you. As New Orleans coming up in all of this expansion talk, it was unexpected, but it's interesting, and I think it throws a little bit of a curveball into the plans of expansion because maybe Kansas or not Kansas, New Orleans gets that bid, and maybe they're expansion 33. Who
It's
knows?
wild that this conversation comes up now. Like you said, Bettman's not sure when it's going to happen,
Yeah.
and it's interesting that the conversation does come up now and what could be coming and who knows how long. It's just obviously every league, every sport is looking to expand, it sounds like, and hockey's doing it to what it seems like so far to the best with Seattle and Vegas and the success they've had right from the get-go. That other cities are definitely intrigued about what could be coming.
Yeah, and well, that's all. I like like I said, I just find it interesting, and a team that I know both of us are watching closely and find a little interesting at this time of the season, especially with the moves they made throughout the year. That's the Anaheim Ducks, and are they a team to watch out for in the playoff race? They just acquired Billy Huso today, provides some goaltending depth, gives Huso a change of scenery, and it saves Detroit that 3.6 million cap hit. So, Chris, like, what does this strike to you as somebody looking at this team is with Gibson's injury not being a problem per Elliot Friedman is do you think this is just purely a depth move to help the AHL team, or do you think this is something that maybe they find another number two and flip them?
Well, so realistically, this is Gibson's, I believe, his second injury this season as well, because Dostal took over the starting job for them right out of the gate. And here we are sitting, end of February, and the Ducks are 7-2-1 in their last 10, 6 points back of a playoff spot, and also have gotten a point in every game in February so far. So they got a stretch coming up. They got the Sabres, Canucks to end the month, and they got Chicago. To me, I mean, one of the teams you're chasing is in that game. You come away in that 3-game stretch with 6 points, you're right in that playoff spot. Like you're, if not in the playoff spot, you are maybe 2-3 points back from it. So this move to me, obviously, like you said, Friedman did say Gibson's injury doesn't seem serious, but with it being his second injury, this is a move that gives them depth, that they have a goalie that they can trust, who is young, and I mean he's only in this is his fifth NHL season, so it's somebody they can trust right behind, and a backup that can realistically come away with points if they need to in a game. I mean, he did well for Detroit the last couple of years. Obviously, wasn't the goalie he was in St. Louis, but they're a team that I'm worried about because, like I said, time and time again, Vancouver's selling from what they've seen. I mean, they haven't done much. They've extended the guys they have brought in, but they got rid of their big names, and we'll get to a couple other names that we've heard them talk about. And they have their own injury issues with Demko, and Calgary's doing their thing. They're still right there. Utah's hovering. We've heard conversations we'll get to about St. Louis. Like, there's teams that are selling. So from adding Huso, is this signaling Anaheim being buyers at the deadline? I mean, it's a team that we haven't seen the playoffs. They're usually at the bottom of the Pacific the last couple of years. It's a team that I think, obviously, seeing the Kings win in 12 and 14, I believe, that, obviously California, Vegas winning when they did, like that area of hockey's growing. Getting Anaheim back in the playoffs would be a great sign for hockey out in California. And so, I mean, it's a good move. On the side of the Red Wings in the trade, it tells me something big's coming because they just freed up all that cap space. There's a move going to be made. And obviously, I wrote right before the break that there was talks of Tarasenko was going to be gone over Four Nations. That was what was being talked about, and that never happened. So is there a move coming that includes Tarasenko in it that brings the Red Wings back a big piece that they can have realistically in their top six, because they've had Kane, aside from, I think it was just the first 2 games back, but Kane has been in the bottom six as of late. And so that's a player, obviously, you add to the bottom six, like I talked about a couple weeks ago when we had the Red Wings discussion. They need a bottom six scorer, and you move Kane down there. That's a scorer that usually is in the top six that's now adding to your bottom six. Plus, they also have injuries that just happened over the weekend, and Andrew Kopp, who got placed on IR today, and Rasmussen got hurt yesterday against Anaheim with an interesting hit that wasn't called. Zegras obviously got 3 games today.
And I tweeted out earlier today that there was no intention to play the puck. Zegras immediately charges at him, doesn't break a stride, and then jumps into the hit. And principal point of contact is the head. And I also mentioned I'm pretty sure it's going to be 2 or 3 games, knowing how things go. And It was 3 games. I would have been surprised if it was 1 or 4, to be honest with you, because there's been a lot of prior hits like that for first-time offenders have been that 2 or 3 game mark. I don't see the NHL handing out a 1-game suspension for a hit like that, because then guys will be like, oh, I can just sit 1 game and send a message to another team. Like, you don't want that precedent to start. And with that hit on Rasmussen, Zegras, who also has his name's come up in trade talks, does this maybe affect him because he is suspended now, and maybe teams won't want to be adding that to their team, because who knows, Zegras could just end up getting suspended at bad times. And this whole conversation that we're having is the Ducks, are they a team to watch out for in the playoff races? Well, now you lose Zegras, who is one of your top guys, and how do you look for the next 3 games with him out? And there's a lot to consider. And with that hit, maybe a team says, you know what, we need a guy who can score and has a bit of bite and isn't afraid to throw some pretty cheeky hits. Maybe a team wants that, but there's also supplemental discipline for a reason. And I found it funny how you brought up you feel like a big move is coming, because I was going to ask you what do you think Detroit does with this additional space? And you answered my question well before I got to ask it. And I just find all of this trade talk funny, because the Houston trade happens right before we hop on, and I was like, I'm sitting there, I'm like, okay, maybe something else is going to happen. Maybe we're going to see 1 or 2 more, but it's not the case. And now some of the trade deadline stuff is, I see a little bit more conversations start to creep across the timeline, and continued talk around Seth Jones over the last week. He says that he's talking with the Blackhawks about the possibility of a trade. Friedman added on Saturday headlines that Jones prefers to be dealt to a contender. David Pagnotta of the Fourth Period reported that Jones is open to a return to the Columbus Blue Jackets or a trade to the Dallas Stars, Colorado Avalanche, and Florida Panthers. Now, I also wonder if Edmonton and Chicago has talked about a potential swap between Darnell Nurse and Seth Jones, 2 players that I feel could benefit from a change of scenery, which is needed considering the climate of both teams and the markets. Nurse, who has been to Stanley Cup Finals, can bring that experience over to Chicago, and it could be valuable to players like Bedard and younger defenders. Whereas Jones can come over to Edmonton, and he's hungry to prove himself, as I'm not making 9.5 to be somebody just thrown to the side in considerations. Is he's going to be looking to prove himself should he be traded. But I also think that's why he wants to be dealt to a contender, is he wants to prove himself as valuable to a contender, because realistically, Chicago isn't making the playoffs this year unless they go on an absolute tear, and even then, I don't even think that'll be the case.
No, I see him. I mean, I think the perfect fit is Columbus. I mean, that's my personal opinion. I mean, he has his best couple of years of his career in Columbus. He's been there. He knows the environment. They're a team that's now competing. I mean, none of us really going into the season saw them as a team that could compete for a playoff spot in the Eastern Conference, and now here they are.
Yeah.
And I think he's a great fit there. And the other, I wrote today too, that I think Dallas is a great fit for him. I really do. I just, obviously, both they shoot opposite, but they lost Miro Heiskanen. So,
Yeah.
I mean, he's a left shot defenseman, whereas Seth Jones is a right shot, but it's a piece that they could add to their blue line that could help them come playoff time. And I mentioned that a couple weeks ago, that losing Miro could be something that Dallas looks to address on defense come the deadline. Now a name comes available that wants to go there, wants to play for a contender, and they're right there. So,
and that's good leverage for teams like Dallas in negotiations. It's like, well, your guy wants to come here, and you're asking X, Y, and Z, and we don't want to pay that, but we'll pay this. Like, it's a whole negotiation tactic that's now in Dallas's favor. And I bring up the Nurse Jones swap for two guys who are making Nurse is making 9.25 and Jones is making 9.5. But Jones is in years 3 of his 8-year deal. The only issue with that I see right now is right now, because I don't see Chicago retaining money for the next 5 years on that deal. I just cannot see that happening. But a $9.5 million cap hit, unless a significant player is coming back to kind of balance out the dollars, it's going to be an issue for this season till the end of the year. This year, like next year and beyond, is not the issue with the salary cap going up like it is. And Jones's step back and play with Chicago, it could be, like, especially in recent years, it could be, or it can make teams like Dallas or Florida hesitate to acquire him because, well, like, we saw him be good in Columbus and he had his best years there, but Chicago being in a rebuild and having this great defenseman who hasn't been able to play to that level like he did in Columbus is the Chicago rebuild a factor into his play, or is it just him being a little bit more exposed to the environment he's in and not being able to play with another elite talent at the moment? And that's that could be the case for a lot of players. And like, maybe we're seeing that with guys like Mikko Rantanen, which we'll get into in a bit, but that's kind of crazy for myself to kind of suggest there. But the term and the money is, teams could look at it and kind of scoff because, well, like I said, Jones going back to Columbus could work because, well, you could pair him with Werenski and, hey, maybe it looks like a bargain for the rest of the contract. But now teams like Dallas, Florida, where cap space is very stretched at the moment, do they decide to take that swing, or do they look the other way? Like, there's
what about a name we talked about already? Vegas, with Shade Theodore being out. Open up the LTIR spot.
Man.
I don't see it, but I'm just saying, like, we've seen him do it before.
And the thing is, Jones, he fits the mold perfectly in Vegas. 6'4" defenseman, like about 220 or so. And yeah, he fits that mold perfectly that Vegas wants, because Kelly McCrimmon came out himself and said, I want trees on the back end. I want the bigger defenseman. Well, Jones is a big, physically imposing defenseman when you think about it. And he maybe it works. Maybe it works Jones in Vegas, or maybe it works Jones in Dallas. Who knows? But at the end of the day, with the trade potentially being there or maybe not, we all know that, or you and I both know just from the conversation, is he's going to be hungry to prove himself. And players that have been hungry to prove themselves, well, Jordan Binnington, he kind of proved himself in the Four Nations face-off. And is he a possible trade deadline candidate now after a stellar Four Nations performance? And I think it's clear to note that even guys like Darren Dreger have said that it's speculation about a potential Binnington move, considering where St. Louis is in the standings, and maybe they're starting to trend upwards. But also, Binnington's 31 years old, making $6 million for another 2 seasons after this year, and if they're willing to retain or take back another hefty contract, maybe it works for them, because maybe Binnington doesn't fit into their 1 year plan post trade deadline. Maybe he doesn't fit into the contract term that he originally signed for. And like I said, it's speculation. And the only team that I could think of that could take a swing is Edmonton, because their last 2 games is you get blown out by Washington, and then you get beat up by Philadelphia. Is you had back-to-back rough games, and I think that it could warrant a change in that if they can pay the price for Binnington, and if they're willing to make the swing, because I think that he could fit in Edmonton, because he has the personality, and he's shown that he shows up in big games. And Edmonton, they're just coming off of a Stanley Cup final loss in Game 7 of the 2024 Stanley Cup final with Stuart Skinner in net. Could their past worries about their goaltending be starting to creep up on them when they're having this lull so close to the deadline? Because there's not a lot of time left to make a decision of, do we go out and get another guy and make Skinner the backup, or things like that?
Well, I mean, this might be the perfect, going back to Binnington in general, this might be the perfect sell high situation for them, where there's not many goalies on the market right now for trade. I mean, the biggest one at the time was Gibson, and obviously we talked about the Ducks and how they're on the uptick. So now Binnington has the tournament he has, and do the Blues look at that and go, hey, we can move him, get a big piece back here in a trade, make us better at the same time, or even work on getting pieces back for the future and make themselves, back into that conversation for the Central Division in general. And I agree with you. I mean, I wrote down Binnington to Edmonton made the most sense. I thought, like I said, Gibson was the name, and I thought he was going to be going to Edmonton. But if Binnington is available, and that is the case, depending upon what they want back for him, Edmonton makes the most sense. They need a goalie, and he would take the starting job right from Skinner, right from the get-go. And he's got Stanley Cup experience. I mean,
yeah. Well, like I said, Binnington has played in big games. He has showed up when he needs to, but when he's not on his game, he's not on his game. But I think that could be the case for any goaltender, is when you're not on your game, you're not on your game. Like, you can make the example of every goaltender to ever suit up in a game of professional hockey. Like, Binnington, when he's on his game, look at the 2019 Stanley Cup Finals, a very painful loss for a lot of people that I know, and including myself, is watching that game, is Binnington was lights out. Is he played on his head, and it was extra gravy with just the entire performance that he put up. And then you go into his contract, and he has a couple of good seasons and a down year, and then Four Nations roll around, and people are wondering, is he the starter? Is Aiden Hill the starter? Because Montembeault was there for injury assurance. I thought you could have brought in Logan Thompson, but with that of itself, and with the way that the selection worked out, is they chose Montembeault instead. But I think that the conversation around Hill or Binnington was interesting, because would you take the guy who has played in more big games and has collapsed in big games and knows both both sides of that mental sword? Or do you take the guy that has he's ridden the high of being in the big games, but hasn't experienced the low? Like Binnington, when he blew the 6-1 lead to Austria, and Canada still won 7-6. You're on the low of that mental sword. When you come back up at the Four Nations and you win 3-2 in overtime to take the tournament, and you win for your country, is, well, you're back up. And I could see Edmonton making that swing. Like we both said it now, and it makes sense because you have Skinner, who's been there with the team, so he knows what the locker room's like. But Binnington has played and won the trophy already. So does that get Edmonton over the hump? And like, I think that's the conversation to be had at that point. It's not why they should acquire him. It's how does he impact the roster?
Now that he's out there and it's official, it's going to be an interesting name to watch over the next, 10, 11 days, 12 days.
Yeah. And teams that have stuff out there, the Columbus Blue Jackets, and it's to be noted that if they fall out of the playoff race, they could consider trading Ivan Provorov. And from now until next Friday, it's a long, long ways away, but things can happen, and maybe they trade Provorov for assets or another player that helps them in the long term, or maybe they just trade him, get a pick, and then they bring him back in free agency. And the latter that I just mentioned was something that has been a lot of discourse and discussion as of late, which I find interesting because you don't see a lot of teams trade a guy and immediately sign them back.
Yeah.
And I think that teams could be hesitant to trade for Provorov if it's known that he has no intention to play anywhere but Columbus. So how does this idea of Provorov going right back to Columbus in free agency impact Columbus's trade negotiations if they want to get a higher prospect, or maybe like a first or second round pick?
I think realistically, going back to even Columbus in general, is no matter what happens this weekend is what makes their decision. They got 2 games against the Red Wings. If they lose both their games, they're selling. And I think they're going to move, like you said, Provorov is the first name. And my opinion always has been, like, you get traded. The reason why people don't come back is you get traded. Like, hey, do I really want to go back to a place that just got rid of me? And do I want to go back to that organization? And the other issue becomes, you get traded somewhere, and now they have the rights to talk extension with you right away. So, yeah, they can hope that, he is going to hit free agency, and maybe they have that, behind the back deal. But he goes somewhere, plays there for, 10 games, and feels like this is a new home. I'm having a great, 10 games, whatever, here, and putting up good numbers. And the organization comes to you with a contract extension. You go, you know what? I'm staying. And now
Vegas with Theodore being out, what if they say, you know what, we'll take a swing and bring in Provorov for a rental?
I mean, all the defensemen on the list right now, of the ones available,
there's a lot
of
defensemen, and I'm almost wondering if Vegas, they don't bring in a top guy, and if they decide to bring in a guy like Luke Shen, who we'll get into right away, get in a guy who has experience in the playoffs and plays a hard-hitting style. Maybe that's what they're looking for. Like, I don't see Provorov being their first target, but with all the smoke around Provorov, Chris, it's one of those things that I look at it, I see it, I don't want to believe it, but I know it's going to happen because, like you said, if Columbus loses both games to Detroit, we're going to see selling immediately, or the chatter is going to pick up at least. And from now until next Monday, it's going to be a lot of interesting things to come out. And cap space is limited. Deadline cap space is limited. So teams are going to be looking for retained money, stuff like that. Deals are going to get cut for third-party things. And one team that has our noted ongoing contract negotiations with one of their players who is a free agent at the end of the season is the Utah Hockey Club and Karel Vejmelka. He's going to be an interesting trade target. I don't see why Utah and Vejmelka can't come to a reasonable contract. Vejmelka is Utah's number one goaltender. If he's saying, "Oh, I just want to be the number one goaltender," well, you're Utah's number one guy, and Utah is. I think they're in a good position to maybe add a couple of good pieces because they're getting a fully healthy roster again, and they could go on a run because they have that roster again. I don't think Utah has played a game this season with a fully healthy roster. Is
And they were in a playoff spot to start the year. I mean,
Yeah.
for the good majority of the first quarter of the year. And that's in part to their goaltending and what they had.
Yeah. But I'm almost wondering if it's like the Vejmelka thing, it's a similar thing to Provorov, is there's a backdoor behind the thing stuff that's going on, or maybe it's just the demands are too high and Utah doesn't want to pay that, which I honestly think is silly, but negotiations are weird. But Vejmelka is 28. I can see him in his current state, if he re-signs with Utah, I don't see a contract being an 8-year deal. I can see 6 or 7 years, around just shy of $6 million, give or take. But I think what helps it is if it's a lower term, it's going to be a lower dollar amount. But if it's a higher term, like say if they want that 8 years for Vejmelka, it's going to be a higher dollar amount. That's what I think is going to kind of ultimately drive the boat. Is maybe Vejmelka wants a 3-year deal and Utah wants a 7-year deal. Just speculating there, but that could be a very drastic thing to go from, oh, the team wants to commit to you for 7 years, but you want 3, and well, you gotta meet in the middle maybe, or you have to take an extra year. Like, there's so much to consider with how this could happen. And from the time of recording until when the trade deadline happens, maybe Vejmelka is extended and this is just all smoke and mirrors in the media.
I got to imagine he's going to get extended. I mean, I can't see a world where he's getting traded. Again, I mean, shocking trades happen on deadline day. There's been trades years past that we didn't see coming. That's the first thing that always comes to mind for me. But I see him staying, and it might, like you said, it might not be the 7-year long term, but they might come to a middle ground where they can both meet, where he is there for the next couple years, maybe even as much as 4 to 5. But
I don't see why, considering Vejmelka being 28, is most players when they're 27, 28, or 29, they're going to want that long-term deal. And maybe it's opposite of what I was saying earlier, and like, who knows? But I think given Vejmelka having been Arizona's number one guy for a handful of years and proving that he is the number one goaltender, and now he's Utah's number one guy, I don't see him moving at the trade deadline unless it's a trade that moves the needle for Utah. At the end of the day, it's got to move the needle, and Vejmelka, I can see him staying with Utah at the deadline. So here's another, like, the Shen brothers, could they be reunited at the deadline? And Chris, I don't see why teams would make a trade to acquire both Shen brothers, or why Nashville would bring one in, or why St. Louis would bring Luke in. Like,
I think the world just says it. I mean, I see them both somehow ending up back in LA where it all started. That's my personal opinion. The more I think about it, like the second I saw that show up, like that we talked, like when you put it in, and then I saw like the stories about it, and I just said, this screams back to LA on the Kings where they all started, because they were both there at one point. They obviously didn't play together, but it just, that makes the most sense. Like you said, I don't see St. Louis acquiring one or Nashville acquiring the, I mean, I don't see that happening. But what team is going to be that team to make that deal to bring both in? And why not the team that had them both to begin with when they started their careers?
Yeah. And another interesting thing that I saw online was the possibility of the Toronto Maple Leafs really shaking up their team and bringing in Luke and Braden Shen. Because the whole thing with Tavares being a free agent and you're going to need a center to take that role. But why with I've mentioned the salary cap quite often, and I'm frankly it's going to get mentioned throughout the whole deadline talk. But with the way that things are going and how it's skyrocketing, another word that anyways, with the way that things are going, I don't see why Tavares wouldn't be signed for 6 million, 5 million for another 4 years. Is he's shown that he's still playing to an elite level. It's like Stamkos at the moment, still playing to an elite level in his current age. And maybe it's Brad Trey Living looking at his roster and saying, I want to get younger and maybe a bit more physical. And when Trey Living was in Calgary, there was a season where I thought they could have bullied their way to the Stanley Cup like the 2011 Boston Bruins because they were built to kick the crap out of teams, like realistically. And it obviously that didn't happen. Is they got bounced in the second round that year, but maybe it's Trey Living looking at bringing in Braden Shen as a center who is physical to give a bit more bite to the team, and Luke Shen, who was drafted by the Toronto Maple Leafs. But like you said about LA, it makes sense because both players kickstarted their careers in LA. That's where they got known to be the Shen brothers. Like Luke and Braden Shen, where they were prior to all X, Y, and Z. When they were in LA, that's where things took off for them. And they made a name for themselves in that city. So why wouldn't LA maybe take that swing, you know? So
It's the one team that I just to me makes the most sense out of all 30 of the other 31 other teams.
yeah. And unless retention is in play, I don't I don't see it happening. And maybe it was just a hypothetical thrown out into the media so GMs could see, oh, maybe they just wanted to see how it would come across for reaction purposes. And well, Chris, this has been one that you and I feel like every single week now we bring it up. And I know it's going to come up again next week because something may or may not have happened by next week's podcast. But that's Mikko Rantanen. And well, now with the Carolina Hurricanes, Elliot Friedman comes out on Saturday headlines and mentions that he was tabled a 9-figure offer. He's currently deciding his future, and I now wonder what a trade scenario looks like for Mikko Rantanen because they gave up a lot, and you're going to be expecting a lot back. They've per Friedman on Saturday headlines is the Hurricanes have tabled Rantanen an offer of $100 million plus for 8 years, around the Connor McDavid mark. Rantanen remains undecided on his future. We could see Carolina pivot and trade him before the deadline, or could we see a sign and trade scenario in the offseason similar to Matthew Tkachuk?
I could see the sign and trade. I mean, I got absolutely roasted in Hurricanes groups the other day for when I wrote my article about him potentially being on the move again. And Hurricanes fans were like, he just got here. Like, let's wait it out. And when I read that, I'm like, this is what they're saying. This is what Friedman's saying. Like, this is what's going on. Like, it sounds like he could get moved.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know what, like you said, trade part. The offseason makes the most sense for the trade.
Yeah.
Is it possible at the deadline? Yes, but that would be something to me last second, right before somebody comes in and says, we missed out on this, this, and this. Here's a huge package, and let's see if we can go get them, and then we have the chance to talk extension.
Yeah, and well, all things considering is a sign-in trade does make sense because Carolina got too close with the Gensel one, so they had to trade his signing rights. And so maybe we see Carolina look back on past mistakes and say, you know what, we got to at least recoup something and not lose him for nothing. Maybe they negotiate with the team. Oh, you want to pay him $13.25 million for 8 years. He's agreeing, but he wants $10,000 more. X, Y, and Z details and all that. Maybe that's what it looks like. But I think the asking price, should a trade happen before the deadline, looks something similar to what he was traded for, which is an NHL roster player, a prospect, and picks. So I think looking at what he was traded for, asking that or something similar in return is fair. And who knows, maybe people or maybe teams will up the asking price if they can get an extension done and then we have an in-season sign and trade.
We started the episode with talking panic moves.
Yeah.
What if they make a panic move?
Yeah.
And deadline day is they're just on the phone with him all day. Obviously offers come in all day for him, and they take the best one, they keep it there, and they're on the phone with him all day, trying to get an extension done, changing the numbers, and they can't come to something. And right as it hits, boom. Okay, this is the best offer we had. Is it still available? Yep, done.
Okay, well, Chris, it was good to talk some hockey this weekend. There's only going to be a lot more as time passes with trade deadline getting so much closer, and
it's going to be chaotic.
And I love the chaos and the last minute deals that trickle in, and AHL trade deadline's not too much after. It's going to be fun to see the chaos and maybe potential panic moves. And I think that does it for Inside the Ring episode number 27. Thank you for listening and have a good day, night.